For over 100 years, one drink defined the city of Detroit. Walk into any store, any diner, any kitchen in Michigan, and if someone had an upset stomach, they reached for the same golden bottle, Vernors Ginger Ale. Fiercely carbonated, with a ginger bite so sharp it made your eyes water and cleared your sinuses in a single sip. The factory that made it stood on Woodward Avenue, and it was a Detroit institution. A neon gnome, 55 feet tall and burning 75,000 watts, poured ginger ale into a bottle above the street and glowed like a beacon for miles. Behind glass walls, families stood and watched the bottling line run at 1,000 bottles a minute, 6 million bottles a day, while children drank ice cream floats at the marble soda fountain. Men spent 30 years on those lines and trained their sons to stand beside them. Then, in 1966, on the company's 100th birthday, everything changed. In a single decision, a century of family ownership ended, and what came next was 19 years of slow corporate destruction. 5 different owners, each one cutting deeper than the last. Pure cane sugar became high fructose corn syrup. Real ginger extract became natural flavors. 4 years of aging in oak barrels became 3 years, and then it became a lie. On January 18, 1985, the Detroit factory produced its final bottle. The workers were sent home. The building was torn down. This is the story of how corporate greed destroyed Detroit's own drink. It is not really a story about soda. It is a story about what happens when men who never tasted a product, never lived in a city, and never met a worker are handed something a community loved and told only to make it cheaper. The factory is gone. The formula is gone. The workers are gone. What is left in the bottle today just carries the name. Stick around, because to understand what was lost, you have to go back to a frontier town and a boy sweeping the floor of a drugstore. James Vernor was born in the spring of 1843 in Albany, New York. When he was 5 years old, his family moved west to Detroit, a city that was still rough around the edges. Unpaved streets, wooden sidewalks, a frontier town straining to become something more. In 1858, at the age of 15, Vernor took his first real job as an errand boy at a drugstore on Woodward Avenue. It was not glamorous work. He wrapped parcels, made deliveries, and swept the floors. But he was fast, he was reliable, and the owners noticed. Within a few years, he was promoted to junior clerk, learning the pharmacy trade one bottle at a time. Then came the war. In 1862, at the age of 19, James Vernor enlisted in the 4th Michigan Cavalry. He served as a hospital steward, the man responsible for medical supplies, for assisting the surgeons, for caring for the wounded. His unit fought at Gettysburg. It marched with Sherman to the sea. It was part of the force that captured the President of the Confederacy in Georgia in 1865. Vernor rose to the rank of second lieutenant before he was discharged that summer. Now here is where legend takes over. The company would later tell a beautiful story. Before he left for the war, they said, young Vernor was mixing a ginger syrup in the pharmacy, and he sealed it inside an oak barrel and marched off to fight. 4 years later, he came home, opened the barrel, and discovered that time had perfected his drink. It is a wonderful story. It is also not true. His own son admitted in an interview in 1936 that his father did not create the formula until after the war was over. A trademark filing shows the drink did not truly enter commerce until 1880. The barrel legend was printed on labels for decades, but the truth was quieter. Vernor came home, went back behind the counter, and worked at the recipe until he had something no one else had. In 1866, shortly after his discharge, he opened his own pharmacy on Woodward Avenue. Like most druggists of the era, he kept a soda fountain, where the line between medicine and refreshment was blurry. His ginger ale began as a tonic, ginger to settle the stomach, vanilla for flavor, carbonated water to make it pleasant. He served it by the glass. And customers came back, not because they were sick, but because it tasted like nothing else. That decision, to keep refining instead of settling, is where the empire truly began. What made Vernors different was right there in the slogan he chose. Deliciously different. It had more ginger than any rival, enough to create that famous bite. It was sweeter, with notes of vanilla, and it carried a mellow, aged character that other ginger ales simply lacked. Word spread across Detroit, and soon other pharmacies wanted to sell it. So Vernor built a system. He would sell them his extract, but only if they installed his equipment and followed his recipe exactly. The fountains that served his drink were fitted with ornate ironwork and a distinctive letter V, and a few of those originals still survive today. He was fanatical about quality. He treated every glass of ginger ale with the same care he gave a prescription, scrutinizing every ingredient and purifying his own carbonated water. This was a man the state trusted. He held Michigan Pharmacy License Number 1, the very first licensed pharmacist in the entire state. He helped found the Michigan Board of Pharmacy and served on it for years. He sat on the Detroit City Council for a quarter of a century. Outside the pharmacy, he was a genuine civic force. He clashed again and again with the mayor, Hazen Pingree, over who should control the city's streetcars, the businessman insisting on private enterprise, while the mayor pushed for public ownership, and neither man ever gave an inch. To this day, a Detroit thoroughfare, Vernors Highway, carries his name, a quiet monument to how completely one druggist had woven himself into the fabric of his city. By the middle of the 1890s, the ginger ale had outgrown the drugstore. It was more popular than everything else he sold combined. So Vernor made the choice that would define the rest of his life. He closed the pharmacy and bet everything on the drink. He opened a new location closer to the heart of the city, dedicated entirely to Vernors, and his son joined him full-time. Father and son worked side by side, often 16 hours a day, washing bottles, mixing syrup, and delivering to fountains across Detroit. The business grew as the city grew. By the early 1900s, Vernors had a new slogan, Detroit's Drink, and it was not marketing. It was simply true. But a small plant near the docks could not keep up with what was coming. To make Detroit's Drink for all of Detroit, Vernors was going to need a cathedral, and he was about to build one. In the years around the First World War, the company made its first great leap. It bought an old power plant standing right on the Detroit River, at the foot of Woodward Avenue, and converted it into a state-of-the-art bottling plant. The design was ingenious. It used gravity itself to move the work. Bottles started at the very top of the building and traveled downward, floor by floor, through washing, then filling, then capping, then labeling, until they emerged at the bottom, packaged and ready to ship. And on the wall facing the water, the company mounted an enormous illuminated sign. This was the sign that truly lit up the riverfront. Passengers on the ferries crossing to Windsor, to Belle Isle, and to the Bob Lowe Island amusement park would look up and know they were passing Detroit's ginger ale factory. Getting a Vernors at the factory fountain before boarding the ferry became a ritual, handed down through Detroit families for generations. Inside, a marble soda fountain served the drink by the glass to thousands of visitors a day. Through the 1920s and 30s, the operation grew, until it filled an entire city block along the river. It was not just a factory, it was a landmark and a point of civic pride. But the plant everyone pictures, the one with the gnome, came later. In the 1950s, the city wanted that riverfront land for a massive new convention center, so it offered Vernors a trade. Give us the river and take a site up on Woodward Avenue in Midtown. Vernors agreed, and in 1954 it opened something even bigger. Designed by one of Detroit's most respected architectural firms, the new plant was a showcase of modern 1950s design. Clean lines, sleek surfaces, and walls made of glass. It covered more than 200,000 square feet, and it was built for two purposes at once: to make ginger ale and to be seen making it. The centerpiece was the sign, a gnome, the company's beloved mascot, 55 feet tall, pouring a bottle of ginger ale in glowing neon. It burned 75,000 watts. It threw off so much heat that it needed its very own air conditioning system just to keep from cooking itself. It was switched on for the first time on a June evening in 1954, and from that night it was a Detroit landmark, visible for miles up and down Woodward Avenue. And then there were the glass walls. Vernors wanted the public to watch. Families would park on Woodward, press up against the windows, and stare at the line. It was mesmerizing. 1,000 bottles every single minute, moving in perfect synchronization from washing, to filling, to capping, to packaging. 75,000 cases a day. 6 million bottles a day. The plant ran around the clock, in 3 shifts, and to keep the lines full it even bottled RC Cola under contract on the side. But Vernors was always the heart of it. The company had nothing to hide. It wanted Detroit to see the cleanliness, the speed, and the care that went into every bottle. Through the golden decades, the plant became something a factory rarely is, a destination. On a summer afternoon, families would drive in from across the region, tour the floor, watch the bottling, and treat it like a day out. Tour groups moved through in a steady stream. Schoolchildren on field trips pressed their noses to the rails above the line, and every one of them left with the taste of fresh Vernors still stinging pleasantly in the back of the nose. For a certain generation of Detroiter, a visit to the Vernors plant was as much a part of childhood as a ball game or a trip to the lake. Then the family went inside to the fountain. They ordered floats and Boston coolers and fresh Vernors straight off the line, so cold and so carbonated it made your eyes water. The children pressed their faces to the glass, drank their ginger ale, and walked out with a memory they would carry for the rest of their lives. Ask a Detroiter in their 70s today, and they can still close their eyes and see that line moving. That is what this factory was. Not a building, a shared childhood. But what gave the drink inside those bottles a taste no rival could copy was something you could not see through the glass at all. The secret was time. The syrup base, ginger, vanilla, and a closely guarded blend of other ingredients was aged in oak barrels for 4 full years. 4 years. That slow aging mellowed the flavors and knit them together into something other ginger ales, rushed to market, could never match. It was expensive and it was patient, and the label said so in plain words. Aged 4 years in wood. That line was not advertising, it was a guarantee. By the early 1960s, Vernors was at its peak. Sales passed $9 million in 1963. The drink was sold in 33 states, though 80% of every bottle was still drunk in Michigan. It was Detroit's drink, Michigan's drink, and it had become something more than a beverage. It had become medicine. The tradition was simple, and it was everywhere. If your stomach was upset, you drank Vernors. If it was serious, your grandmother heated it on the stove and handed you a warm glass. For a cold or a sore throat, hot Vernors with a squeeze of lemon. For a hangover, ice cold. Doctors would gently explain that it was mostly placebo and hydration. Michiganders did not care. Generations of evidence told them it worked, and they passed that faith down to their children like a family heirloom. It reached far beyond the sickbed, too. A cold bottle after cutting the grass on a July afternoon. A Boston cooler shared at the counter after church on Sunday. A case hauled out to the garage refrigerator for the summer and rationed out to the neighborhood kids. Weddings, funerals, holidays, hot days, and sick days, the golden bottle was simply there, part of the furniture of ordinary life. That is the strange power of a regional brand. It is not just a flavor, it is a marker of home, so tied to a place and a people that to taste it anywhere else in the country felt almost like cheating. And there was the Boston cooler, born somewhere in these years. Vernors poured over vanilla ice cream, a float unlike any other. The name is a mystery to this day. It was not named for Boston Boulevard, because that street had not even been built when the drink got its name. However it happened, the Boston cooler became as much a part of Detroit as the ginger ale itself. Behind the glass, the workforce was multi-generational. Fathers ran the bottling lines for 20 and 30 years. then brought their sons in to stand beside them, learning the trade on the very same machines their fathers had run. It was not just a job, it was an inheritance. The men took an enormous pride in it, because they knew they were making Detroit's drink, and they knew their work mattered. Everything about it felt permanent. The factory had stood since 1954. The family had owned the company for nearly a century. The formula had been perfected and left untouched for decades. Vernors felt as fixed and as certain as the Detroit River itself. Nothing that solid, that woven into a city, could simply vanish, could it? In 1966, Vernors turned 100 years old. A century of family ownership, a century of making Detroit's drink. And on that anniversary, the family decided to sell. The announcement stunned the city. The buyers were not Detroiters. They were a group of investors tied to the New York Stock Exchange, outsiders who had never bottled a bottle, never worked a shift, never lived in the city that loved the product. To them, Vernors was not a heritage, it was an asset. Why did the family walk away? They never fully explained it. The heirs were aging, and there was no clear successor who wanted the business. The national giants, Coca-Cola and Pepsi, were swallowing the market, and regional brands were beginning to struggle. Perhaps the family saw the future and cashed out while the price was still good. Whatever the reason, the sale happened quietly. No celebration of 100 years, just a transaction. Money changed hands and the Vernor family was gone. For the workers on Woodward Avenue, the news was unsettling. They had worked for a family. James Vernor II had known many of them by name. The new owners were strangers who ran the company not with pride, but with spreadsheets. And the spreadsheets asked a very different set of questions. How much does 4 years of aging cost? How much would we save at 3 years? How much cheaper is corn syrup than cane sugar? How much is real ginger? And what could we replace it with? This is the decision the whole story turns on. Not one dramatic betrayal, but a quiet new logic. The men who now owned Detroit's drink did not ask how to protect what made it special. They asked only how to make it cheaper. And once a company starts asking that question, and only that question, everything that made the product worth loving is already living on borrowed time. The aging, the ginger, the sugar, the workers, the factory itself. One by one, the spreadsheet would come for all of it. What followed was 19 years of the product being passed from hand to hand and gutted a little more at every stop. In 1971, it was sold again to a company called American Consumer Products. The 4-year aging was too slow and too expensive, so they cut it to 3, and they changed the label. Aged 4 years in wood quietly became flavor aged in oak barrels with no number at all, vague on purpose. Most customers did not notice, but the promise was already cracking. In 1979 came the change that Detroit never forgot. Vernors was bought by United Brands, a corporation whose main business was bananas and meatpacking. The company that owned Chiquita now owned Detroit's ginger ale. And United Brands looked at Vernors and saw a problem. The drink held a tiny share of the national market, and 80% of its sales were still trapped in one state. They wanted a national brand, but that sharp, strong, distinctive taste was the very thing outsiders found too intense. So they made a decision. If the flavor was the obstacle, then change the flavor. Now the gutting accelerated. Pure cane sugar was swapped for high fructose corn syrup, cheaper by pennies a bottle, and pennies a bottle across millions of bottles adds up fast. Real ginger extract gave way to the words natural flavors, a phrase that can mean almost anything. Real vanilla became artificial. The aging shrank further, or stopped entirely, while the label kept hinting at barrels that may no longer have existed. And the people who had been drinking Vernors for 50 years knew immediately. The carbonation felt weaker. The bite was gone. They wrote letters. They complained to stores. And the company told them, again and again, that the formula had never changed. It was a lie, and every old Michigander could taste it. The workers on the line knew it better than anyone. They saw the shipments arriving at the loading dock. They saw the aging barrels standing idle. They knew, with their own eyes and their own hands, that they were no longer making the drink their fathers had made, only a cheaper thing wearing its name. Some of them tried to say so. They raised it with management, quietly at first, then plainly. But management was not listening for that. There was exactly one priority now, printed at the top of every memo and every meeting, and it was cost. A man who had spent 30 years perfecting a craft was told in so many words that his expertise was an expense. Then, on January 18, 1985, the last real bottle rolled off the Woodward Avenue line. The workers did not even know it was the last one. They thought it was just another shift. The next day, United Brands announced the factory was closing. Production, they said, was moving to the suburbs. It was not true. There was no suburban factory. A recently laid-off sales manager told the Detroit Free Press the truth the company would not admit. Vernors, he said, was defunct. Except for a handful of people in the syrup department, the company was dead. What remained was a name and a formula, and the bottling would simply be handed off to Pepsi. There was one last insult. That spring, facing public fury for abandoning the city, United Brands announced it would build a new Vernors warehouse and headquarters near Eastern Market, right in Detroit. It sounded like a peace offering. Workers hoped a few jobs might come back. It was another lie. Within months, the banks refused to lend against it, doubtful the company was even making money, and the building was never built. The promise had only ever been meant to quiet the anger. On January 25th, the workers collected their final paychecks. Multi-generational careers ended in a single afternoon. Fathers and sons who had stood together on the line were separated for good. Men who had given the company 30 years, who had planned to retire from that floor, walked out with almost nothing. The severance was thin, and there was nowhere to relocate to, because the suburban factory had never existed. For a while, people kept expecting it to come back. Surely, they told each other, a drink this beloved, this profitable, this woven into the city, could not simply be allowed to die. Surely someone would step in. But no one did. The machinery was gone. The recipe had been handed to strangers. And the men who knew how to make it the old way were scattered across the city, telling their grandchildren stories about a factory that once ran 1,000 bottles a minute behind walls of glass. The knowledge did not transfer. It simply evaporated, the way skill always does when no one is left who is paid to remember it. The building on Woodward sat abandoned. The bottling machines were pulled out and sold. The glass walls that had shown off the line went gray with dust. The gnome still stood above the street, but the neon had gone dark. In time, the salvage crews came for the sign, and by the late 1980s, it was a skeleton of metal, a monument to what the city had lost. Then the wrecking equipment arrived, and in 1987, the plant that had defined a stretch of Woodward Avenue was torn down. When the dust settled, nothing remained. The site would eventually become luxury apartments, expensive homes for young professionals, built on the ground where working men had once made Detroit's drink. The gnome sign itself survived, rescued by collectors, and today it hangs indoors in downtown Detroit, watching over a city it no longer lights. The brand kept moving after that, further and further from home. A&W bought it and dropped the beloved gnome from the packaging. A British candy company, Cadbury Schweppes, owned it in the 1990s and finally let the aging claim disappear from the label entirely. Then Dr. Pepper. Then Keurig Dr. Pepper, headquartered in Texas and Massachusetts, about as far from the Detroit River as a company can get. Today, Vernors is bottled in Holland, Michigan, just enough of a Michigan connection to sell the nostalgia. And that is what is really being sold now, nostalgia. The current bottle still wears the gnome and a picture of a wooden barrel and the words "a Michigan original since 1866. But read the ingredients and there is no ginger listed and no vanilla. Just carbonated water, corn syrup, and natural and artificial flavors. Everything James Vernors spent his life perfecting, the real ginger, the real vanilla, the cane sugar, the 4 years in oak, the Detroit factory, and the pride of the men who ran it, was stripped away 1 penny at a time. What is left tastes vaguely of ginger ale, carries a famous name, and sells on the memory of something it no longer is. There are a few hard lessons buried in this bottle. The first is that when a product is flipped from owner to owner, each one asking only how to extract more value, quality does not stand a chance. The second is that cost-cutting does not kill a product in one blow. It kills it by pennies, each cut too small to notice, until one day, everything that made it special is simply gone. And the third is the cruelest. A brand can outlive the very thing that made people love it. The name survived. Everything else died in 1985. You can see the same pattern everywhere. Once you know to look for it. A steel mill, a shoe brand, a brewery, a hometown newspaper. Each one bought by people who measured only the next quarter, and quietly hollowed out until the name was the last thing left standing. Detroit watched it happen to Vernors in real time, bottle by bottle, penny by penny, and the city has never quite forgiven it. That is why an old Michigander will still corner you to talk about a ginger ale that stopped tasting right 40 years ago. It was never really about the ginger ale. But maybe the story is not entirely over. Somewhere in an old recipe book or a company archive, the original formula still exists. Real ginger, real vanilla, 4 full years in wood, and every few months, someone in Michigan asks the same question. Why can a small craft maker not bring it back, exactly the way it truly was, and let a new generation feel that ginger bite for the very first time? It would be expensive, it would be slow, but it would be real. And in a world of corn syrup and natural flavors, real might be exactly what people are thirsty for. So let me ask you, do you drink Vernors today, and can you taste the difference? Did your grandmother ever pour you a hot Vernors when you were sick, and swear that it would cure anything? Did you, or your father, or your grandfather, spend your years on those bottling lines on Woodward Avenue? Tell your story in the comments below, because the people who lived this history deserve to be heard. And if you want more forgotten stories of the companies and the cities that built America, then like this video and subscribe. Faygo, Stroh's, and Sanders are still out there waiting to be told. The factory is gone, the formula is gone, but the memories are still here and they still matter.